3:47 a.m. Norfolk Commercial Harbor. Pier 7, Dry Dock Annex. FBI hostage rescue team operators moved in single file along the portside catwalk. 31 agents. No headlights. No radio chatter. Only the hum of a decommissioned tugboat sitting dark in its berth, and the low tide pulling against the pier supports beneath them. Behind the tug, 3 shipping containers sat stacked in a 2+1 formation. Their manifest listed them as engine cores awaiting scrap tender. Property of a Maritime Salvage LLC, registered in Beaumont, Texas. No flags. No violations. Nothing on paper that warranted a second look. Except for one thing. His name does not appear in any public filing connected to this case. The federal indictment refers to him only as CW1, Cooperating Witness 1. Within the FBI's Norfolk field office, agents called him the Welder. 8 days earlier, he noticed something. A condensation ring around a vent grille on the middle container, and fresh silicone seals on a crate that supposedly held dead machine parts. That observation would trigger one of the largest joint agency rescue operations in the Mid-Atlantic region in the past decade. Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Homeland Security Investigations, FBI Hostage Rescue Team, Coast Guard Investigative Service, all converging on a section of pier that most port workers walked past without noticing. 19 missing persons, ages 6 through 14, reported missing from 4 states between late October and mid-November of 2025. 106 days. The breach team cut the false bulkhead in 90 seconds. To understand how 19 missing persons ended up sealed inside a shipping container at a Norfolk dry dock, you need to go back to the fall of 2025. To a logistics operation running for months without producing a single federal lead, and to the specific geography that made Norfolk the perfect hiding place. The Hampton Roads area sits at the intersection of one of the largest naval installations in the world, and one of the busiest commercial shipping corridors on the East Coast. On any given day, the harbor moves military supply vessels, commercial cargo ships, commercial salvage crews, civilian contractors, Coast Guard patrol boats, and Navy logistics support. Federal security is present everywhere, but federal attention is split everywhere. That split was not an accident. The trafficking cell, later identified as the Gulf-to-Chesapeake line, had studied Hampton Roads for at least 2 years before the fall of 2025. Court documents filed under seal and partially released in February of 2026 describe a systematic analysis of federal patrol rotations, naval review schedules, and the congestion windows that occur when large fleet movements dominate port security attention. The cell was reading the harbor's operational calendar like a tide chart. The period they selected, late November through early spring of 2026, aligned with 2 overlapping windows. First, the Navy's annual fourth-quarter logistical consolidation, when dozens of auxiliary vessels move in and out of Hampton Roads for maintenance cycles, flooding the manifest system. Second, the period immediately following the 4th of July flyover rehearsal corridor activations, when federal air assets are temporarily rerouted and port liaison presence spikes in ways that paradoxically create blind spots in secondary inspection coverage. The LLC they used was called Atlantic Salvage Recovery Partners, registered in Beaumont, Texas in March of 2025. It held a valid bonded maritime cargo license. It had leased the dry dock annex at Pier 7 through a subcontracting arrangement with a legitimate commercial salvage operator who had no knowledge of what Atlantic Salvage was using the annex for. The lease paperwork was clean. The LLC filed quarterly reports. It had a website, a phone number that rang to a voicemail checked twice a week, an email address that responded to routine inquiries, Every surface detail had been constructed to withstand casual scrutiny. Nobody applied anything more than that. 3 welded shipping containers. Manifest described them as engine cores, model class LMV 400, awaiting scrap tender. Estimated weight, 11,000 kilograms per unit. Manifest signed by a notary in Beaumont. The listed weight was accurate. That was part of the design. The containers had been modified before arriving in Norfolk. Internal false bulkheads reduced the visible interior to roughly 1/3 of the actual volume. The remaining 2/3 had been retrofitted with ventilation systems using commercially available HVAC components, silicone-sealed grille covers, and a battery-backed power draw routed through the tug's shore power connection, making it invisible to external monitoring. When port inspectors walked the annex, their instruments read nothing unusual. The containers looked exactly like what the manifest claimed. The modification work had been performed at a private marine fabrication yard outside Pascagoula, Mississippi, over approximately 6 weeks in the summer of 2025. The fabrication yard was legitimate. The work order described interior insulation and climate control retrofitting for research equipment storage, unusual enough to be memorable, but not unusual enough to generate a report. The fabricators were paid in full, in advance, by wire transfer from a corporate account in the Cayman Islands. They completed the job in early August. The containers were transferred overland to a staging yard in Virginia Beach in early September and moved to Pier 7 in mid-October, 3 weeks before the first child went missing. The cell had also solved the logistics problem that defeats most long-term concealment operations: supply delivery. Every 48 to 72 hours, a panel van registered to a marine repair company in Portsmouth made a routine delivery to the tug berth. Listed deliveries: cleaning solvents, lubricants, general maintenance supplies, routine enough to avoid scrutiny, frequent enough to function as a supply line. The driver carried valid pier access credentials obtained through a legitimate application submitted on behalf of Coastal Marine Maintenance LLC 4 months earlier. The application had been approved in 14 business days. Nobody flagged it. The operation had been running for 3 months without a single flag from port security. Then a welder noticed a condensation ring. He was a certified maritime welder with 19 years of experience, subcontracted through a Norfolk Marine Services company to assist in cutting apart the decommissioned tug at Pier 7. He had worked a dozen similar jobs, decommissioned vessels in various stages of decay, hauled to dry dock annexes where subcontractors spent weeks reducing them to scrap. The Pier 7 tug was standard work. He had been at the annex for 4 days when he noticed it. The date was December 17th, 2025. Late afternoon. The light was gone by 4:30 that time of year. He was prepping equipment for the following morning when he walked the length of the annex to check the shore power feeds. The 3 containers were behind him, and to the right, stacked in their 2+1 configuration. He had walked past them every day without a second look. This time, something made him stop. The middle container had a standard industrial vent grille on its port-facing side. He had seen hundreds of those over his career. What he had never seen was a grille with fresh silicone beadwork around its entire frame. Not weathered silicone. Fresh. Applied within the last few weeks. The color was still bright against the container's rust-patched exterior, a clean white line running the full perimeter of the grille housing, with small finger-pressed smoothing marks visible at each corner. Whoever had applied it had done so carefully. Carefully enough to read as routine maintenance from 20 meters away. From 2 meters, standing directly in front at eye level, it read differently. He stood there for a moment. Then he looked down. On the container's exterior, just below the grille, There was a faint arc, a condensation ring, the kind that forms on cold metal when warm, humid air is exhausted through a vent. The ring was roughly the diameter of a dinner plate. Its edges were soft, not sharp, meaning it had formed and reformed multiple times. Meaning whatever was generating warm, humid air inside had been doing so long enough to leave a repeated mark on the steel. Engine cores don't breathe. He did not open anything. He did not touch the containers. He did not take photographs. He walked back to his vehicle, sat in the cab for 20 minutes, running through what he had seen and asking himself whether he was misreading something ordinary, and then called the Coast Guard tip line. The call came in at 7:12 p.m. on December 17th. He spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He described the grille, the silicone beadwork, the condensation ring. He described the manifest content, engine cores, as inconsistent with what he had observed. He used the phrase "doesn't add up" 3 times. The duty watch officer at Coast Guard Sector Hampton Roads logged it as a Priority 3 maritime safety concern. Possible undeclared volatile contents in cargo containers at a commercial dry dock annex. Standard protocol. Refer to Port Authority for follow-up inspection within 72 hours. It sat in the queue for 11 hours. What changed the timeline had nothing to do with the welder's call. On the morning of December 18th, the Navy suspended its Arabian Sea search operation for a missing MH-60S crew member, and in the chaos that followed, 4 federal liaison officers from 3 separate agencies, NCIS, HSI, and Coast Guard Investigative Service, were assigned to a joint logistics briefing at Naval Station Norfolk. One of them reviewed overnight tip traffic as part of a routine coordination check. It was a habit, not a protocol. The agent who did it later described it in his interview as something he did every morning when in a joint environment, because joint environments were where things fell through the cracks between agencies. He saw the welder's report. Fresh silicone seals on cargo described as engine cores. Condensation. He pulled the manifest for Pier 7 Annex. The LLC name, Atlantic Salvage Recovery Partners, returned no federal flags, but it returned almost nothing else. A company registered 8 months prior with minimal operational history, holding a bonded maritime cargo lease at a naval-adjacent facility, with containers sitting idle for over 3 months. The registered tonnage matched the manifest. The subcontracting chain traced back cleanly. On paper, the only issue was how little footprint the company had left. He flagged it to his HSI counterpart in the room. HSI pulled the LLC's formation documents within the hour. The registered agent for Atlantic Salvage Recovery Partners was Vicente Salazar Moya, listed at an address in Beaumont, Texas. His name appeared in a closed HSI database under a different context, a 2023 investigation into a Gulf Coast-based logistics network suspected of using bonded cargo facilities to move unspecified commodities between Texas and the Carolinas. That investigation had stalled after a cooperating witness withdrew in early 2024. It had not produced an indictment, but it had produced a name and a pattern. A pattern of using legitimate bonded cargo infrastructure to obscure movement of things that were not disclosed on any manifest. The same name was now on the lease for Pier 7. By noon on December 18th, a joint operations cell had been stood up at the FBI Norfolk field office. NCIS, HSI, Coast Guard Investigative Service, and FBI, 12 senior investigators. 2 federal prosecutors on standby. A real-time intelligence analyst pulling everything available on Atlantic Salvage Recovery Partners, Vicente Salazar Moya, Coastal Marine Maintenance LLC, and the Pier 7 subcontracting chain. The formal request for a federal search warrant for the containers was submitted to the duty magistrate at 2:14 p.m. The warrant was approved at 4:51 p.m. They did not execute it immediately. Here is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it's the decision that defines how this case resolved. The Joint Operations Cell made a deliberate choice to delay the breach by 24 hours. The reasoning: if the containers held what the physical evidence suggested, moving immediately risked spooking whoever was operating the supply line before they could identify the full network. The panel van from Portsmouth was due for a delivery the following morning based on reconstructed patterns. Camera records showed the van had made 6 previous deliveries to the annex, each between 3 and 5 a.m., each lasting between 8 and 14 minutes. The schedule was predictable. If they waited, they might take the van and its occupants at the same time as the breach. That meant more arrests, more of the network, more intelligence about what existed beyond the Norfolk cell. It also meant another night. There are lines in the operational review documents that address this decision directly. The review notes that the joint cell considered and debated the delay, that it was not taken lightly, and that enhanced surveillance was positioned around the annex for the duration. 2 surveillance agents on foot at the pier perimeter. A Coast Guard patrol vessel making irregular passes. A fixed camera trained on the annex access gate that fed live to the operations center. What the review does not resolve, because operational reviews are not written to resolve moral questions, is what that extra night cost. What it meant to the 19 people inside the container. What the hours between 4:51 p.m. on December 18th and 3:47 a.m. on December 19th felt like from inside a steel box. Did the system serve the mission, or did the mission cost too much? That question moved through every conversation inside the Norfolk field office for weeks after the operation concluded. It has no clean answer. Before the breach team reached Pier 7 in the hours before dawn, investigators at the FBI Norfolk field office were building out what they knew about who was inside those containers. The missing persons files had been cross-referenced within hours of the joint cell standing up. 19 names, 19 families, 19 separate missing persons reports filed across 4 state jurisdictions, with 4 different lead agencies, none of which had been formally linked before December 18th of 2025. The youngest was 6 years old, a girl from a small town outside Meridian, Mississippi. She had been reported missing on the 1st of November. Her mother had been grocery shopping. She had been gone for 47 days when the joint cell pulled her file. The case had been classified as a stranger abduction within 72 hours of her disappearance, based on witness accounts describing an unknown vehicle near where she was last seen. Local law enforcement had worked the case hard. They had generated leads. None pointed toward Virginia. The oldest was 14, a boy from a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. He had gone missing on the 19th of October, the earliest disappearance in the group. 106 days by the morning of December 19th. His case file noted that he had last been seen leaving a community recreation center on a Friday evening. Surveillance footage from a parking lot camera 2 blocks away showed him getting into a vehicle voluntarily. The vehicle was later identified as a rental car. The rental had been paid for in cash in Wilmington. The credit card used for the deposit was fraudulent. The trail went cold by mid-November. The remaining 17 fell between those endpoints in age, geography, and circumstances of disappearance. Some had been taken from public spaces. 2 had been taken from the immediate vicinity of their own homes. 1 had disappeared from a school bus stop on a Tuesday morning, in a neighborhood with active street traffic, in broad daylight, and no witness had reported seeing anything. That case had generated significant regional media response in late October, The response had faded by mid-November. Cases fade faster than families expect them to. What the investigators building out the victim file on December 18th noted, and what would later become significant in the prosecution's case, was the geographic pattern. The abductions had all occurred within a corridor running from the Mississippi Gulf Coast to the Carolina Piedmont. None had occurred in Virginia. None had occurred north of Richmond. The corridor had been carefully selected to avoid jurisdictions with active interagency missing persons task forces and to minimize the likelihood that any single law enforcement agency would see the full pattern. The Gulf-Chesapeake line had studied law enforcement geography the same way it had studied port security schedules. The families had been living inside that absence of pattern recognition for weeks. 19 separate families in 4 states, each believing their child's case was singular, each not knowing there were 18 others. The overnight surveillance on December 18th ran without incident until 3:17 a.m. on December 19th, when a dark-colored panel van approached the pier access gate. It carried 2 occupants. Port cameras captured the plate. HSI ran it in real time. The van was registered to Coastal Marine Maintenance LLC, the Portsmouth Marine Repair Company that had been making the supply runs. It matched the plate from the previous 6 delivery records. Surveillance teams held position. The van was allowed to pass. 2 men exited at the annex. They moved to the lower right container, not the middle one, and spent approximately 9 minutes inside before returning to the van. Agents watching on body camera feeds noted they were carrying supplies consistent with the described manifest: sealed containers, what appeared to be water storage units, 2 soft-sided bags whose contents were not visible. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. No hesitation at the access points. No lookout behavior. No visible communication beyond functional gestures. It was routine to them. At 3:31 a.m., the surveillance team lead radioed the operations center with a 3-word assessment. Consistent with occupancy. The decision to execute was made at 3:39 a.m. FBI Hurt was given the go order. The van was to be stopped at the pier gate on exit. Simultaneously, 4 agents with a separate warrant were moving on a Portsmouth address, a residential property linked to a second name pulled from the LLC's formation documents. There was one complication that the operational plan had not fully accounted for. The Pier 7 annex had a single-access catwalk that ran along the port side of the dry dock. The only approach to the containers that avoided open sightlines was along that catwalk, single file. FBI Hurt had trained on container breaches in wide formation environments. Single file approach on a narrow industrial catwalk, in pre-dawn darkness, with water on 3 sides, was a different problem. The catwalk was approximately 1.2 meters wide. The planking was weathered hardwood over a steel subframe, and it flexed perceptibly under load. Moving 31 agents along it in tactical sequence would generate audible movement and visual signature that increased the risk of compromise before the breach element reached the stack. The entry team lead made a real-time adjustment, reduced the breach element to 8 operators instead of 12, used the remaining 4 designated breach support operators as perimeter and exit security on the landside approach. The larger team footprint on the catwalk created noise and movement risk that outweighed the reduced breach strength. The remaining 19 operators held at the staging position near the pier access building, available for immediate forward movement if the situation escalated. The entry team lead made the call in under 4 minutes. 8 operators. Single file. Port catwalk. At 3:47 a.m., the breach team reached the container stack. The 2 men from the supply van were still at the annex. One was standing near the rear of the lower right container, apparently checking the door seal. The other was at the van's passenger side, his back partially to the catwalk approach. They saw the operators coming at approximately the same moment the team reached the container, a gap of perhaps 2 seconds between the first man's visual contact and the second man's awareness. In those 2 seconds, both men made the same calculation: run. One made it approximately 40 meters along the pier before he was taken to the ground by 2 perimeter agents positioned along the landside approach. The takedown was clean. He offered no physical resistance. The second man ran toward the pier's far railing, apparently calculating that the water below was an escape route. A drop of approximately 6 meters to the dock surface below, not water, but concrete. He reached the railing and had both hands on it when a perimeter agent caught him by the jacket collar and pulled him back. The agent later described the moment in his statement as approximately 1 second from a very different kind of report to write. Both were in federal custody by 3:51 a.m. The breach itself, the entry team cut through the container's external access panel, the false one, using hydraulic shears. The false panel had been engineered to look like a standard container wall section, with rivets placed to match the container's original construction. The hydraulic shears went through it in 61 seconds. Then the false bulkhead inside, a welded steel partition, half-centimeter plate, flush-fitted against the interior container walls with silicone compound matching the exterior grilles. 29 seconds with a hydraulic spreader applied at the lower left seam, where the weld had been slightly underrun. 90 seconds total. The bulkhead came apart. What the entry team found behind it was documented in the operational report filed December 19, 2025, and partially released in the February 2026 indictment proceedings. The hidden section was approximately 11 meters long, 2.4 meters wide, and 2 meters high. It was ventilated and temperature controlled. The temperature inside at the time of breach was recorded at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It contained bedding pallets, foam mattresses stacked in rows along the port side wall, each with a folded blanket. A water distribution setup consisting of a gravity feed tank mounted near the ceiling, with individual spigots at waist height along the starboard wall. Sealed food storage bins against the forward bulkhead, stacked 4 high. Evidence of habitation extending, based on the volume of materials present and the degree of wear on the bedding and flooring, over weeks to months. And 19 people, ages 6 through 14. All 19 had been reported missing from 4 states: Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi. The earliest disappearance dated to late October of 2025. The most recent was mid-November. They had been inside that container, or in transport to it, for a period ranging from 31 to 106 days. All 19 were alive. The operators who entered first described it later in terms the operational report does not fully capture. The smell of a confined space inhabited by children for months. The way the light from the operator's weapon-mounted lights hit the faces of people who had been living in near darkness long enough that the sudden illumination made them shield their eyes. The size of them. How small they were against the steel walls. The operational report uses the word ambulatory. It notes that agents on scene immediately called for the pre-positioned medical support teams, stage 2 piers over. It notes that blankets were distributed before any were moved. It notes that a Spanish-speaking HSI agent who had been included in the breach support element entered the space within 90 seconds of bulkhead removal and made initial verbal contact, because 2 were from families where Spanish was the primary household language. One detail that stuck with every agent who read the after-action: when the bulkhead came open, nobody screamed. Nobody ran. There was a moment. Operators described it as lasting between 3 and 5 seconds, though several noted it felt longer, when nothing moved on either side of the opening. the flashlight beams, the faces, the stillness. And then, from the back of the space, a child's voice asking if it was morning. It was 3:53 a.m. The agents carrying blankets to the waiting medical vans. That image, documented in a body camera still that was later submitted as part of the evidentiary package and has never been publicly released, became something close to a reference point inside the Joint Task Force for what the operation had actually been about. 19 people, small enough to be carried, walking out from behind a steel wall before sunrise. The medical teams had been staged at the end of Pier 5, 200 meters from the annex, in 3 ambulances and 2 unmarked federal vans. The staging location had been chosen to keep the medical presence invisible from the annex during the pre-breach surveillance period. When the call came through at 3:53, the medical convoy moved. 4 minutes to cover the distance. The first paramedic reached the container stack at 3:57. The medical assessment conducted on site and continued at the Regional Trauma Center described a population showing signs consistent with prolonged confinement, mild to moderate dehydration in 11 of the 19, some degree of vitamin D deficiency in all of them, multiple cases of upper respiratory symptoms consistent with extended exposure to recycled air in an enclosed space, and significant psychological stress markers. None were assessed as requiring emergency surgical intervention. None had injuries consistent with acute violence. The medical team lead's preliminary assessment, filed at 6:30 a.m. on December 19th, described the physical conditions inside the container as having been engineered to maintain them in a viable state, not comfortable, but survivable. The cell had needed them alive and transportable. That calculation had kept them fed and watered and breathing through the weeks they had been inside that steel box. The emotional assessment was a separate and longer document. The FBI's Victim Services Division had pre-positioned 2 trauma-specialized agents with the medical convoy. They rode in the vans to the trauma center. They were in the assessment rooms within minutes of arrival. The preliminary interviews conducted in the hours after the breach, careful, child-adapted, trauma-informed, documented on audio with parental consent, obtained via emergency protocol as families were notified, produced the first coherent picture of what they had experienced during their time in the container. It would be many months before the full accounting was possible. Trauma doesn't organize itself into a linear narrative on command, especially in children. But what emerged from those first hours was enough to understand what had been happening inside that steel box. Enough to understand what had almost happened next. The Portsmouth address was hit at 4:12 a.m. by the secondary team. The property was a 2-story residential structure in a working-class neighborhood 3 blocks from the Elizabeth River waterfront. The team used a standard dynamic entry approach: sealed warrant, announced entry, 40-second breach from first approach to threshold. 4 individuals inside. 2 arrests at the door, both male, both reaching for mobile phones rather than weapons when the door came in. 2 more found in a back room on the 2nd floor with communications equipment, a laptop, 2 tablets, a satellite phone, a signal repeater, and a series of encrypted laptops in a configuration consistent with an active operations center rather than personal workspace. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and takeout food. It had no windows. There was a folding table covered with printed manifest documents, port access schedules, and what appeared to be handwritten delivery logs using a date and quantity notation system that the FBI's document analysis unit would spend the following 2 weeks decoding. The laptops were seized as evidence and transferred to the FBI Cyber Division within 24 hours. They would take longer to process. By noon on December 19th, 6 individuals were in federal custody. 2 from the pier. 4 from the Portsmouth safe house. The sealed indictment had been prepared in parallel with the surveillance operation. It was unsealed 48 hours after the arrests, on December 21st, 2025. It named 8 defendants. Vicente Salazar Moya, the registered agent for Atlantic Salvage Recovery Partners, was among them. His arrest had been coordinated with Texas authorities. He was taken at his Beaumont address at 6:30 a.m. Central Time on December 19th, within 3 hours of the Norfolk operation. The arrest was conducted by HSI agents out of the Houston field office, supported by Hardin County Sheriff's deputies. Salazar Moya was found at home. He said nothing when the agents identified themselves and read the warrant. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked up, not at the agents, but at something past them, and asked whether it was the welder. Nobody answered him. A 9th individual identified in the investigation as a logistics coordinator for the Gulf-Chesapeake line had been under surveillance. He was not at any of the identified addresses when the simultaneous arrests went down. By the time agents reached the 4th target location, a boat storage facility in Chesapeake, Virginia, it was empty. A boat registered to a company name that did not appear in any of the earlier LLC filings was gone from its slip. The slip records showed it had departed 2 days before the operation. He has not been located. The initial interrogations of the 6 individuals taken into custody on December 19th produced contrasting approaches to federal questioning. The 2 men arrested at the pier, both identified in court documents as couriers with operational roles limited to the supply run function, declined to make statements and requested counsel within the first 30 minutes of custody. Their attorneys arrived by late morning. No substantive statements were obtained from either in the initial 48-hour window. The 4 individuals arrested at the Portsmouth safe house presented a more complicated picture. 2 of them, like the pier couriers, invoked and went quiet. The third, a 29-year-old identified in the indictment under the initials DR, requested to speak with the lead federal agent before counsel arrived. The interrogation lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was conducted by an experienced FBI special agent from the Organized Crime Division, who had spent 8 years working Gulf Coast trafficking networks before assignment to Norfolk. The recording was submitted in full to the Eastern District of Virginia and remains under protective order. What the indictment reflects, portions that found their way into charging documents, suggested that DR had a functional understanding of the network's operational structure above the Norfolk cell, including the identity of at least one individual in a coordinating role who was not among the 8 named defendants. That individual is believed to be the 9th defendant. The one not found. The 4th person arrested at the Portsmouth address was a woman, 34 years old, identified in the indictment under the initials MV. She did not invoke immediately. She sat in the interview room for 45 minutes without speaking, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, while the interviewing agent waited. Then she began to talk. Not about the operation, not about the network. She talked about how she had gotten from where she started, a detail that the operational review does not include, but that agents who were present in the building that morning described in later conversations as one of the harder things they had sat through. Not because it excused anything, because it explained a path. And because the path had a beginning that had nothing to do with shipping containers or LLC registrations. It had a beginning in a set of circumstances that looked, from a certain angle, like the same kind of vulnerability that had made them vulnerable in the first place. The interview was terminated when her court-appointed counsel arrived. She has not made subsequent statements. She faces the same charges as the other defendants. What strikes us about this case is how precisely the cell had engineered its own invisibility. Not through sophisticated technical countermeasures or corrupted officials, through the sheer volume of legitimate traffic in a major naval harbor. The harbor was not compromised. It was used. The distinction matters because the same approach is available to the next operation, and the one after that, in any port with the same characteristics. A port is not a locked room. It is a system optimized for throughput. Throughput and security exist in tension by design, and the people who exploit that tension have studied it far more carefully than most port administrators are resourced to study it back. The welder's name, as noted, does not appear in any public filing. His tip line call has been referenced in court documents only as an anonymous public tip. Federal witness protection protocols apply. The lead prosecutors on the case have declined to confirm or deny whether CW1 remains in an active protection status. Here's what this tells us about the system. A civilian, working a 4-hour subcontract on a decommissioned tugboat, noticed what 3 months of port security operations had not. 1 condensation ring. 1 bead of fresh silicone around a vent grille. No training. No authority. No responsibility beyond his own work order. He had every reason to tell himself he was misreading something. He had 19 years of experience telling him that most things have an ordinary explanation. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes weighing that against what he had seen, and then he called the tip line anyway. That call sat in a queue for 11 hours, and still reached the right hands. The machine was slow. It worked. The most surprising part of this case isn't the scale of the operation, it's how small the initial signal was. Not a surveillance intercept. Not an informant network. Not a financial trace. A guy who knew what engine cores look like and noticed that these ones were doing something engine cores don't do. A single sensory detail. A ring of condensation on cold steel, about the size of a dinner plate, in a dry dock annex that most people passed without looking. The 9 defendants named in the indictment face charges under Title 18 of the United States Code, including conspiracy to commit forced transfer, obstruction of commerce by threats or violence, and additional charges filed under seal, pending further investigation, from the Cyber Division's analysis of the seized laptops. Arraignment proceedings began in the Eastern District of Virginia in January of 2026. The arraignment hearings drew no public attention beyond a brief wire service report that ran in 3 regional newspapers and was not picked up nationally. For a case involving 19 missing children recovered from a sealed shipping container, that absence of attention is notable. Cases that are still active, still prosecuting, still with 1 defendant at large, do not always want the attention they might otherwise deserve. Sentencing has not yet been scheduled for any defendant. The 9th individual, the logistics coordinator, remains at large. The encrypted laptops recovered from the Portsmouth safehouse were fully processed by February of 2026. The decryption work required 3 weeks, and the assistance of 2 separate private contractors operating under federal security clearance. What the laptops contained, beyond communications referencing other port facilities, included a partial financial ledger documenting transactions associated with the Gulf-Chesapeake Line's operations going back to mid-2024. The ledger used a coded notation system that took investigators 2 additional weeks to fully interpret. When they did, the transaction volume it described was significantly larger than the Norfolk operation alone could account for. The network had not started in Norfolk. It had expanded to Norfolk. The laptops contained communications referencing at least 3 other port facilities, 2 on the Gulf Coast and 1 in the Pacific Northwest. Warrants for those facilities were executed in February and March of 2026. Both Gulf Coast locations were found to have been vacated. The Pacific Northwest location produced evidence of prior use but no active operation. Someone had cleared them. The network had extended further than the Norfolk cell alone. How much further is still being established?